My name is Sarah Whitmore, and for most of my life, I believed my father loved my older brother more than he loved me. I never said those words out loud, not even to myself. Some truths settle so deeply inside you that they stop sounding like thoughts and start feeling like facts. Growing up in rural Tennessee, my father, Frank Whitmore, owned the oldest machine repair shop in our county. It wasn't much to look at from the road. A faded red building with peeling paint, a weathered wooden sign, and a gravel parking lot that never stayed empty for long. Farmers, truck drivers, mechanics, and even people from neighboring towns brought him everything from broken tractors to antique engines. Dad could fix almost anything. People used to joke that if Frank Whitmore couldn't repair it, nobody could. What most people didn't realize was that he never cared much about the machines. He cared about the people who depended on them. Whenever someone couldn't afford the full repair bill, Dad would quietly lower the price or let them pay months later. If their tractor doesn't run, he'd tell me, their family doesn't eat. That was simply how he saw the world. My brother Daniel saw it differently. He saw every customer as a dollar sign. Every favor Dad gave away annoyed him. Every discounted repair became another lecture about running a real business. "You'll never get rich like this," Daniel would complain while balancing the monthly books. Dad always smiled without looking up from whatever engine he was rebuilding. "I was never trying to." Daniel would roll his eyes. "You should have been." Those conversations happened so often, they became background noise in our lives. By the time we were adults, our paths couldn't have looked more different. Daniel earned an MBA, moved to Nashville, bought expensive suits, and spoke in words like leverage, optimization, and expansion. I stayed home, not because I lacked ambition, because someone had to help Dad. When Mom died from breast cancer, the shop became quieter. The house became emptier. Dad never asked me to stay. He simply started setting 2 coffee mugs on the kitchen table every morning. One for himself, one for me. Some habits become conversations without words. Over the next 12 years, I learned every inch of that workshop. How to rebuild carburetors, how to diagnose an engine by its sound alone, how to recognize worn bearings just by running my fingers across the metal. Dad never handed me instruction manuals. He taught me by asking questions. What do you hear? What feels different? What are we missing? At first, I hated those questions. I wanted answers. Instead, he taught me how to find them. Looking back now, I understand he wasn't teaching me mechanics. He was teaching me how to think. Daniel rarely visited. Birthdays, Christmas, Thanksgiving if his schedule allowed. Whenever he came home, he'd walk around the shop like an investor inspecting a struggling company. "This place is worth a fortune if someone modernized it," he'd say. Dad would nod politely, then go back to work. One autumn afternoon, about 2 years before everything changed, Daniel walked into the shop carrying glossy brochures from a commercial real estate company. "You should sell." Dad didn't even stop tightening the bolt in front of him. "I'm not selling. You could retire tomorrow. I'm already where I want to be. You could have millions." Dad finally looked up. His blue eyes settled on Daniel with a calm expression I'd seen hundreds of times. "What would I do with millions?" Daniel laughed. "Whatever you want." "I already do." Silence settled between them. The only sound came from the ticking of the old wall clock above the tool cabinet. That cabinet stood against the far wall. Old oak, covered in scratches, every drawer labeled in Dad's handwriting. Beside it sat a battered red toolbox. Rust had eaten through parts of its surface years earlier. The handle was wrapped with black electrical tape. One latch barely closed anymore. I'd offered dozens of times to buy him a new one. He always refused. "This one's earned the right to grow old." I smiled every time he said it. Daniel thought it was ridiculous. You keep thousands of dollars worth of equipment inside something that belongs in a junkyard. Dad shrugged. "Looks can be expensive." Daniel never understood what that meant. Neither did I. Not then. As winter approached, Dad's health began changing. At first, it was little things. A cough that lingered, hands trembling after long days, needing to sit down more often. He blamed age. I blamed stubbornness. The doctor blamed lung cancer. Everything after that happened too quickly. Chemotherapy, hospital visits, good days, bad days. Days when Dad insisted on opening the shop anyway because people still need their tractors. Even lying in a hospital bed, he worried more about unfinished repairs than himself. One evening, As orange sunlight poured through his hospital window, he motioned for me to come closer. "I need you to promise me something." "I will, no matter what happens after I'm gone." He paused to catch his breath. "Don't argue over things." I laughed softly through tears. "We won't." His eyes held mine longer than usual. People don't always become who you think they'll be after funerals. At the time, I thought he was simply tired. Now I know he was warning me. Dad passed away on a cold February morning before sunrise. The entire county seemed to attend his funeral. Farmers, veterans, mechanics, sheriff's deputies, teachers, people I'd never met. One by one, they shared stories I'd never heard. How he'd repaired equipment without charging, how he'd secretly paid medical bills, how he'd driven 3 hours one Christmas Eve to fix a combine before a snowstorm. I realized my father had spent an entire lifetime helping people quietly, without ever telling us. Daniel gave a polished speech. Perfect posture. Perfect words. Perfect timing. Everyone applauded. I stood beside Dad's casket, wondering how two children raised by the same man could have become strangers to each other. 3 days later, we gathered inside attorney Harold Benson's office. The room smelled faintly of leather and old paper. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Harold adjusted his glasses before opening Dad's will. Dad had left the repair shop, the land, the house, the bank accounts, everything. To Daniel. I don't remember breathing. My brother leaned back in his chair with the smallest smile he probably thought nobody noticed. Then Harold looked at me. "There is one additional item." He reached beneath the desk and placed something beside my chair. Dad's old red toolbox. The rust seemed darker than I remembered. The black tape still wrapped around the handle. One latch hung crooked. Harold slid a folded note across the table. "In your father's handwriting." My hands shook as I unfolded it. Only one sentence was written inside. "Everything worth knowing is already inside this toolbox." I looked down at the battered metal box. Daniel actually laughed. "You got the junk." I gently rested my hand on the cold steel. For reasons I couldn't explain, it didn't feel like junk at all. It felt like my father was still trying to teach me one final lesson, and I had no idea that opening that rusty toolbox would change my life far more than inheriting every dollar he had ever earned. I didn't open my father's toolbox that day. Not in the lawyer's office, not in the parking lot afterward, and certainly not while Daniel was watching me with that quiet satisfaction he wasn't even trying to hide. He carried a leather folder under one arm, the deed to the house, the ownership papers for the repair shop, and every legal document that proved our father's entire estate now belonged to him. I carried a 40-pound steel toolbox with chipped red paint and rust creeping along the corners. To anyone walking past us, it probably looked like life had made its decision about which one of us had mattered more. Daniel even patted me on the shoulder before climbing into his SUV. "I'm sorry, Sarah." His voice sounded sympathetic, almost convincing. "I know this must hurt." I looked at him for a long moment. "It does." He nodded as if we'd reached some shared understanding. "If it makes you feel any better, I'll probably sell the shop. There's no future in places like that anymore." I felt something tighten inside my chest. "You've owned it for less than an hour." "It's called moving forward." "No," I replied quietly. "It's called forgetting." He sighed the way people do when they think they're talking to someone hopelessly sentimental. "You always were Dad's favorite helper. And you were always in a hurry." Without another word, he got into his vehicle and drove away. I watched the taillights disappear down Main Street until they vanished around the bend. Only then did I lift the toolbox into the back of my pickup. It was heavier than I remembered, not because of the tools, because of everything it represented. The house felt painfully quiet that evening. For the first time in nearly 15 years, there wasn't another coffee mug sitting beside the sink. No radio, humming softly from the workshop, no familiar sound of Dad clearing his throat before asking if I wanted another cup of coffee. Grief doesn't always arrive as tears. Sometimes it arrives as silence. I carried the toolbox into my kitchen and set it gently on the table. The faded red paint caught the warm glow of the overhead light. I traced my fingers across the worn handle wrapped in black electrical tape. How many mornings had I watched those same hands carry this box into the shop? Thousands. Maybe more. I released the stubborn latch. It clicked open with the same metallic sound I had heard since childhood. Inside. Everything looked ordinary. Combination wrenches, old screwdrivers with cracked wooden handles, a brass hammer polished smooth from decades of use, sockets sorted into small metal trays, pliers, punches. Nothing valuable, nothing mysterious, certainly nothing that could compare to an entire business. For several minutes, I simply stared. Had Dad really meant this? Was the note only symbolic? Had he wanted me to remember him through the tools he'd used his entire life? If so, that was enough. I didn't need money to remember my father. Still, the wording of the note lingered in my thoughts. Everything worth knowing is already inside this toolbox. Knowing, not owning. That single word wouldn't leave me alone. Dad chose his words carefully. Always. He would never have written knowing if he meant having. I began lifting each tool out one by one. Every wrench had initials scratched into the steel. Not names, letters, dates, tiny marks I had never noticed before. Most people would have assumed they were inventory numbers. I knew better. Dad never labeled things without a reason. Under the bottom tray, I found a folded piece of yellowed graph paper. Not hidden, simply tucked beneath the sockets. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a bank account. It was a handwritten diagram of an engine. At first glance, it looked like one of the countless sketches Dad made while diagnosing complicated repairs. But then, I noticed something strange. The measurements written beside the drawing weren't measurements at all. They were page numbers. Page numbers followed by short notes. Chapter 4. Valve Timing. Page 117. Read twice. I frowned. What book? Dad owned hundreds of repair manuals. Why would he reference one without writing the title? Unless he assumed I already knew. The next morning, I drove to the repair shop before sunrise. The building looked exactly as it had every morning of my adult life. Except the parking lot was empty. No trucks waiting, no customers drinking coffee, no lights glowing inside. Daniel hadn't even bothered opening the place. When I unlocked the front door, the familiar scent of motor oil, sawdust, and old coffee wrapped around me like an old friend. Everything remained where Dad had left it. His work gloves still rested on the bench. A half-finished tractor engine waited on its stand. His reading glasses lay beside an open service manual. That's when my eyes stopped. The manual. I hurried across the shop and picked it up. Inside the front cover, written in Dad's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 words. Start with this one. My pulse quickened. I turned to page 117. The page wasn't about valve timing. Someone who didn't know Dad would have thought the diagram was ordinary, but in the margin, barely visible beneath years of grease. Another sentence had been written in pencil. Every machine tells the truth if you learn how to listen. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like him. Then I noticed another page number. Page 284. I flipped forward, another message, then another, then another. Each repair manual pointed toward another manual. Each note built upon the last. Not instructions for fixing engines. Lessons, observations, ways of thinking, questions, mistakes he'd made, short stories about customers, advice about honesty, negotiation, leadership, patience, trust. For hours, I forgot I was standing inside an inheritance dispute. I wasn't reading repair books anymore. I was having one last conversation with my father, piece by piece. He'd hidden an education inside the ordinary objects everyone else ignored. And suddenly, I understood why he'd left me the toolbox instead of the business. Because businesses can be inherited. Wisdom cannot. Late that afternoon, as I closed the final manual, a pickup truck pulled into the gravel parking lot. Old Mr. Jenkins climbed out slowly, removing his cap as he approached. I heard Frank passed. He did. He nodded sadly. Then he looked toward the silent workshop. I've got a broken combine. I hesitated. I'm not sure the shop is still open. He smiled gently. Didn't ask about the shop. He looked straight at me. I asked if you were here, before I could answer. A black luxury SUV rolled into the lot behind him. Daniel stepped out wearing another expensive suit. He glanced at Mr. Jenkins, then at me. Finally, at the open toolbox resting on Dad's workbench. You can stop pretending now, he said. I'm meeting a developer tomorrow. My stomach tightened. What developer? The one buying all this. He swept his arm across the shop. The building, the land. the business. He smiled as though announcing wonderful news. In 30 days! This place won't exist anymore. Daniel's words hung in the air long after he finished speaking. In 30 days. This place won't exist anymore. For a moment, nobody said anything. Even Mr. Jenkins, who had known my father for nearly 40 years, simply stared at my brother as if he'd spoken a language none of us understood. "You can't be serious," I finally said. Daniel slipped both hands into his coat pockets. "I've already signed the letter of intent. You've owned the shop for less than a week, and I've already increased its value." I looked around the workshop. The scarred wooden benches, the old drill press Dad bought before I was born, the faded photographs covering one wall, each showing another generation of local families standing beside tractors my father had repaired. Daniel saw buildings. I saw memories. "You don't understand what this place is." He smiled politely. "I understand exactly what it is." He paused. "A commercial property sitting on valuable land." Mr. Jenkins shook his head. "No, son." His voice was calm. "It's where half this county learned what honesty looks like." Daniel forced a smile. "I appreciate the sentiment." "But sentiment doesn't pay taxes." "No," Mr. Jenkins replied. "It builds communities." Daniel looked at his watch. "I don't have time for philosophy." Then he turned toward me. "I'll give you 2 weeks." "For what?" "Take whatever personal belongings you want." He glanced at Dad's office. "Pictures, furniture, whatever has emotional value. The demolition company handles the rest." The word demolition hit harder than I expected, as though someone had suggested erasing my father's name from history. Daniel walked back toward his SUV without another glance. Just before opening the driver's door, he stopped. "Oh." He looked over his shoulder. "You might want to find somewhere else to work. This building won't be standing much longer." The engine started. A moment later, he was gone. Only dust remained floating above the gravel road. Mr. Jenkins didn't move. Neither did I. After nearly a minute, he quietly removed his cap again. "Your daddy knew." I turned toward him. "Knew what?" "That Daniel would sell." I frowned. "What makes you think that?" A tired smile crossed the old man's face. "Because Frank wasn't surprised by people anymore." He slowly walked toward Dad's favorite workbench. Running one weathered hand across the scarred wood, he chuckled softly. "Your father fixed my first tractor. I was 19. He told me something I've never forgotten." "What?" "Machines don't fail overnight." Mr. Jenkins looked at me. "People don't either." The words settled deep inside me. Dad had seen things long before everyone else. Not because he distrusted people, because he paid attention. That evening I stayed late inside the shop. Rain drummed softly against the tin roof. The workshop smelled exactly as it always had. Warm oil, fresh-cut wood, coffee. For the first time since the funeral, I felt close to Dad again. I returned to the repair manuals. One message led to another. Another pointed toward an older notebook hidden behind a shelf. Inside were years of handwritten observations. Not repair notes, life lessons. Every page revealed another piece of the man I'd thought I already knew. One entry caught my attention immediately. "Never teach someone what to do. Teach them how to see." Another read, "Most expensive mistakes begin with easy money." Then another, "If someone wants the land more than the business, ask yourself why." I stopped reading. Those words weren't old. Dad had written them only 6 months earlier. The ink still looked darker than the others. My heartbeat quickened. He hadn't been writing about customers. He'd been writing about Daniel. The following morning, I unlocked Dad's office for the first time since the funeral. Everything remained untouched. His calendar still hung beside the window. Coffee stains marked the edge of his desk. His reading lamp leaned slightly to one side because the hinge had been loose for years. I smiled despite myself. He always said he'd fix it tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. I sat in his chair. For several minutes, I simply looked around. Then my eyes settled on a small wooden frame sitting beside the telephone. Inside was an old photograph. Me, maybe 12 years old, covered in grease, holding that same rusty toolbox while Dad laughed beside me. I picked up the frame. Something rattled behind it. Confused, I removed the backing. A folded note slipped into my hand. It wasn't addressed. It contained only one sentence. "If you're reading this, You've started asking the right questions. A chill ran through me. Dad had hidden messages everywhere. Not because he expected to die, because he expected someone to listen. Behind the note rested a tiny brass key. No label, no explanation. Just a worn key with the number 17 engraved into its side. I stared at it for a long time. 17. What did it open? A cabinet? A locker? A safe. I searched the office. Nothing matched. Then I remembered something. In the back corner of the workshop stood an old row of steel lockers that hadn't been used in years. Most still had faded numbers painted on the doors. I walked toward them slowly. 14, 15, 16. Then 17. The lock was old, covered in dust. No one had opened it in years. I slipped the brass key inside. It turned effortlessly. The metal door creaked open. There was no cash, no gold, no secret inheritance, just a stack of worn black notebooks. Every cover carried the same handwritten title, Whitmore Repair Journal, Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3. There were 12 in total. Each one documented hundreds of unusual repairs, impossible mechanical problems, custom-built solutions, and techniques Dad had developed over 40 years. Ideas no textbook taught. Methods no manufacturer published. Knowledge earned through decades of mistakes. At the bottom rested one final envelope. My name was written across the front. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single page. Sarah, if you found these journals, then you've discovered what your brother never understood. Money can buy buildings. Money can buy land. Money can even buy businesses. But it can never buy the trust people place in the hands that solve their problems. The shop was never my greatest asset. The people were. And if they still trust you, you'll never truly lose anything worth keeping. I lowered the letter slowly. At that exact moment, the phone on Dad's desk began to ring. Then another phone rang, then another. Within minutes, trucks started pulling into the parking lot. Farmers, contractors, families, people who hadn't yet heard Daniel plan to erase the workshop from the map. They weren't coming because they needed a building. They were coming because they needed the person Frank Whitmore had spent years preparing, and for the very first time since the funeral. I realized my real inheritance had just begun. By noon, every parking space in front of the repair shop was full. I stood just inside the open garage door, still holding Dad's letter, watching pickup trucks line both sides of the gravel road. Some of the faces were familiar, some I hadn't seen in years. Yet every one of them had come for the same reason. Not because of a building, because something had broken. And for decades, there had only ever been one place to bring broken things. Mr. Jenkins stepped inside first. "My combine can wait," he said with a gentle smile. "I figured someone else needed you more." Before I could answer, a young woman carrying a toddler approached the counter. "I don't know if you remember me." I studied her face for a moment. Then it clicked. "Emily Carter," she smiled. "My dad used to bring our truck here." I nodded. "Your father never missed an oil change." She laughed through watery eyes. "No, because your dad would call him if he forgot." She reached into her purse and carefully unfolded an old repair invoice. The paper had yellowed with age. On the back, written in my father's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Paid in full. Family comes first." Emily looked down at the note. "I only found this after he passed." Her voice trembled. "My husband lost his job last month. Our truck stopped running yesterday. I can't afford a repair." I looked at the invoice again. Dad hadn't written off that repair because it made financial sense. He'd done it because someone needed help. Without thinking, I heard myself say the exact words I'd heard him say 100 times. "We'll figure it out." As soon as the sentence left my mouth, I smiled. Those weren't my words. They were his. And somehow, that made them mine too. The rest of the afternoon became a blur. An elderly rancher with a broken hay baler. A school bus driver whose maintenance truck wouldn't start. A volunteer firefighter needing an engine repaired before wildfire season. One by one, they came. Not asking whether the business still belonged to the Whitmores. Not asking who owned the land. Only asking one simple question. "Can you help?" Each time, the answer became easier. Yes. Late that afternoon, I finally opened the first black journal Dad had hidden inside locker 17. Its pages weren't organized by date. They were organized by lessons. The first chapter wasn't called Engine Repairs. It was called Listen Before You Touch Anything. I smiled. That sounded exactly like him. Underneath, he'd written, "Machines tell the truth long before people hear it." Then another line, "People do the same." I read for hours. Every unusual repair contained something larger than mechanics. One story described a farmer convinced his transmission was ruined. Dad had discovered the real problem in less than 5 minutes. A loose bolt. The farmer had nearly spent $12,000 replacing something that wasn't broken. At the bottom of the page, Dad had written, "Never repair the symptom before finding the cause." I leaned back in the chair. He wasn't talking about tractors anymore. He was talking about life. 3 days later, Daniel arrived without warning. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 men in tailored suits climbed out behind him. One carried rolled blueprints. The other wore polished dress shoes completely unsuited for a gravel parking lot. Daniel walked through the shop like he already owned every square inch, which, legally, he did. Morning. Neither of the men introduced themselves. Daniel gestured around the building. "This is the property?" The taller man glanced toward the ceiling. "We'll probably keep the foundation. The rest comes down." Every word landed like a hammer. I slowly closed Dad's journal. "What are they doing here?" Daniel answered casually. "Final inspection." "For demolition." Several customers stopped working. The shop grew strangely quiet. Mr. Alvarez, who had been waiting for a hydraulic repair, stepped forward. "You're tearing this place down?" Daniel offered a rehearsed smile. "We're bringing jobs. We're bringing investment. We're bringing progress." Mr. Alvarez looked around the workshop, then back at Daniel. "My grandfather brought equipment here." "My father did too." "So do I." He shook his head slowly. "This place already brought us something." Daniel's patience began slipping. "I understand people are emotional." "No," Mr. Alvarez replied. "You don't." One by one, others joined him. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Jenkins, the volunteer firefighters, a local deputy. Nobody shouted, nobody argued. They simply stood together. Daniel glanced around the room for the first time. He looked uncomfortable, not because anyone threatened him, because he suddenly realized something no financial report could measure. He owned the property, but he didn't own the trust that filled it. That evening, after everyone had left, I remained alone inside the workshop. The setting sun cast long golden beams across Dad's old workbench. I opened another journal. Near the middle, an envelope slipped onto the floor. Unlike the others, this one wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to whoever tries to buy my shop. Confused, I opened it carefully. Inside was another handwritten letter. "If you're reading this because you believe you've purchased my life's work, you should know something. This building was never the business. The business was built every time someone drove home believing honesty still existed. If you think you can own that with a signature, you've already misunderstood everything that made this place valuable." I read the final line twice, then a third time. Dad hadn't been writing to comfort me. He'd been writing to whoever believed money alone created success. Outside, headlights swept across the windows. A black pickup stopped beside the shop. An older man stepped out wearing a weathered denim jacket. I recognized him immediately. Thomas Reed, the county's largest equipment supplier. He had worked with Dad for nearly 30 years. He removed his hat before entering. "I heard Daniel signed papers." "He did." Thomas nodded. Then he placed a thick envelope on the workbench. "I've been waiting to give this to the right person." I looked at the envelope. "What's this?" He smiled. "Your father made me promise." "Promise what?" "That I wouldn't hand it to you until your brother believed he'd already won." Thomas Reed waited until I closed the workshop door before speaking again. The evening sun stretched across the concrete floor, turning the old oil stains golden for a brief moment. He pushed the envelope closer. "Frank trusted you." I swallowed. "He trusted Daniel, too." Thomas shook his head gently. "No, he loved Daniel." "There's a difference." Those words settled heavily between us. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a thick stack of contracts. At first glance, they looked like ordinary business agreements. Then I noticed the signatures. My father's. Thomas Reed's. Nearly every major farm in the county. My eyes widened. "What is all this?" Thomas smiled. 40 years. 40 years of handshakes that eventually became paperwork. I flipped through the pages. Lifetime maintenance agreements, preferred service contracts, emergency harvest repair commitments, seasonal equipment inspections. The dates stretched back decades. Some had been renewed every single year. None of them mentioned Daniel. None of them mentioned ownership of the building. Every agreement named only one operating entity: Whitmore Repair Services. I frowned. "But Daniel owns the business." Thomas slowly shook his head. "No, he owns the property." I looked up. "Those aren't the same thing." My heart began beating faster. "What do you mean?" Thomas pointed toward one paragraph. "Read this." I did. The contracts were between local customers and the licensed repair operation, not whoever happened to own the land beneath the building. If the operating mechanic retires or passes away. I continued reading aloud. Clients may choose whether to continue service with any qualified successor. I looked up in disbelief. They can choose. They already have. He smiled. Every one of them. The next morning, the shop opened before sunrise. Not because I planned it, because people simply kept arriving. Word had spread through town, not about the inheritance, about Daniel's plans. Customers walked through the front door carrying more than broken machines. They carried handwritten letters, old receipts, photographs with Dad, stories. Mrs. Parker brought cookies. My husband said Frank once fixed our truck on Thanksgiving morning. I figured somebody working here ought to have breakfast. Mr. Alvarez placed a faded picture on the counter. It showed him standing beside his father and my dad after rebuilding an old tractor nearly 30 years earlier. I thought you'd want this. Each visitor reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. Dad never advertised. People advertised him. By lunchtime, the waiting list stretched 3 weeks. I hadn't asked anyone to stay loyal. They simply had. Just after noon, Daniel arrived again. This time, he looked irritated. Not confident, not polished, just frustrated. He walked straight into the office without knocking. "What are you doing?" "Working." "You can't." I raised an eyebrow. "I just did." He threw a folder onto the desk. "I've had 6 customers call me this morning." They all canceled. I remained silent. They're refusing to work with the redevelopment company. He stared at me. "Did you tell them to do that?" "No." "You had to. I didn't have to tell anyone anything." I stood and walked past him into the workshop. People waved as I passed. Someone thanked me for finishing a repair before harvest. Another customer asked if coffee was ready. Daniel noticed every single interaction. None of them looked at him. For the first time in his life, he was invisible inside his own building. He followed me outside. This is ridiculous. They're choosing sides. No. I faced him calmly. They're choosing trust. You think this is about trust? I know it is. His voice hardened. I own everything here. I glanced toward the line of waiting trucks. Do you? He looked confused. The building? Yes. The land? Yes. The customers? I let the question hang. Neither of us answered, because we both already knew. Trust had never been included in the inheritance. That evening, I returned to Dad's journals. Volume 8, halfway through. A folded sheet slipped onto my lap. It wasn't another lesson. It was a list. 23 names. Every major farm owner in the county. Beside each name, one short sentence. Teach them before they need you. I smiled through unexpected tears. Dad hadn't built customer relationships. He had built friendships. He had spent decades solving problems before anyone even asked. No marketing campaign could compete with that. As I closed the journal, my phone rang. The caller ID surprised me. "Daniel," I answered quietly. "What is it?" His voice sounded different. Not angry, uneasy. "The developer pulled out." I said nothing. "They said the land isn't worth what they offered anymore." "Why?" "They said." He stopped. "They said the value wasn't the property. It was the reputation attached to it." I closed my eyes. Dad had been gone for nearly a month. Yet somehow, he was still teaching both of us. Daniel spoke again, almost in a whisper. "What did Dad leave you, Sarah?" I looked across the workshop. at the battered red toolbox, at the journals, at the people still laughing over coffee after another long day. Then I answered honestly. He didn't leave me something. He left me someone. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? I smiled softly. It means he spent 40 years teaching me to become the one thing nobody can inherit. The person people choose. For the first time in weeks, Daniel didn't have an answer. He stood in the middle of the workshop, surrounded by machines that no longer seemed to interest him. The silence between us wasn't filled with anger. It was filled with realization. He looked at the rusty toolbox sitting on Dad's workbench. That's all he left you? I rested my hand on the worn handle. No, he left me 40 years. Daniel frowned. What are you talking about? I opened the toolbox and slowly began taking the tools out, laying them across the bench one by one. The brass hammer, the old socket set, the cracked wooden screwdrivers. None of them were expensive. None of them were collectible. They're just tools, Daniel said. They're lessons. He shook his head. I don't understand. I know. You never wanted to. I reached into the bottom of the toolbox and pulled out the first repair manual Dad had marked. Then another. Then one of the black journals from Locker 17. Finally, I handed him the very first note Dad had left me. He read it silently. Everything worth knowing is already inside this toolbox. He looked up. That's it? Read it again. He did. This time, slower. Then he sighed. I still don't get it. I smiled sadly. You've spent your whole life believing wealth is something you own. Dad believed wealth is something you become. The following Saturday, the town held its annual Spring Farmers Breakfast. For decades, Dad had attended before opening the shop. This year, I almost stayed home. Instead, I carried the rusty toolbox into the community center. People noticed immediately. Not because it was valuable, because they recognized it. I remember Frank carrying that thing. He never bought a new one. He said it still had work to do. Laughter spread through the room. One by one, people shared stories. Stories I'd never heard before. Mrs. Carter stood first. When my husband passed away, Frank repaired my truck for free. He told me paying him could wait. It never did. Mr. Jenkins smiled. He knew it wouldn't. But he also knew I'd spend the next 10 years helping my neighbors. Another farmer laughed. I tried paying him with homemade pies. He accepted. The room erupted into laughter. For 2 hours, nobody talked about engines. They talked about kindness, integrity, patience, the things my father had quietly practiced every day without expecting recognition. That's when I finally understood. Dad hadn't built a successful repair shop. He had built a culture. A week later, Daniel called. His voice sounded different than it ever had before. Can we meet? I hesitated. Okay. We met inside the empty shop after closing. He wasn't wearing one of his expensive suits, just jeans and an old flannel shirt I'd seen him wear years ago. He looked tired, older somehow. He placed a folder on the workbench. I've been thinking. I waited. I spent my entire career chasing bigger numbers. He looked around the workshop, and somehow, Dad became the richest man I ever knew. He slid the folder toward me. Inside was a single document, a property transfer agreement. I stared at him. What is this? I'm selling you the building. My heart skipped. I can't afford this. I know. I looked up. He smiled faintly. So I'm not charging you what it's worth. I studied him carefully. Why? He glanced toward the toolbox. Because I finally opened one of Dad's journals. I blinked. You did? I found the one he left in his office. What did it say? Daniel laughed quietly. It wasn't about business. It was about me. He swallowed hard. He wrote, "Don't confuse success with admiration. People may envy your money. They'll only trust your character." Daniel rubbed his eyes. I spent years trying to prove I was smarter than him. He shook his head. I never realized he was trying to make me wiser. 3 months later, the sign above the building changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Whitmore Repair Shop became Whitmore Community Repair and Training Center. Every Wednesday evening, local teenagers came to learn basic mechanical skills. Not because they all wanted to become mechanics, but because fixing machines taught something larger: patience, responsibility, problem solving, listening. Exactly as Dad had taught me. The old journals became lesson plans. The rusty toolbox sat in a glass display near the entrance. People often asked why I didn't restore it. I always smiled. Because it tells the truth exactly the way it is. One quiet afternoon, nearly a year after Dad's passing, a young boy wandered into the shop with his grandfather. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He stared at the toolbox for a long time. "Why is everyone looking at that old box?" His grandfather smiled. "You should ask her." The boy walked over. "Was it your dad's?" It was. "It looks broken." I knelt beside him. "It is." "Then why don't you throw it away?" I looked at the scratches, the rust, the worn handle wrapped in black electrical tape. Then I remembered the countless mornings I'd watched my father carry it through these very doors. Because some things become more valuable every time they're used. The boy nodded as if he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. Either way, I hoped one day he would. As he and his grandfather left, I looked around the shop. Customers laughed while waiting for repairs. Students worked beside retired mechanics. Coffee brewed in the corner, just as it always had. Nothing looked expensive, yet everything felt rich. Dad hadn't left me the largest inheritance. He had left me the only one that grows every time it's shared. The rusty toolbox had never contained hidden gold, secret deeds, or stacks of cash. It had held something far rarer: the knowledge to solve problems, the patience to teach others, the humility to serve before being served, and the understanding that the greatest legacy isn't measured by what you leave behind. It's measured by the lives that become better because you were here.